What is an indulgence? Have they changed since Martin Luther protested the use of them? So, this is one of the questions that always seems to come up when it comes to Catholics and Protestants, mostly because it's kind of what started off the Protestant Reformation. Now, before we get into what indulgences are, I think we need to understand what sin is. Now, we see that sin has two kind of effects to it. The first is that there is a wounding of our relationship with God. At its core, sin is a rejection of God. That's what sin is. It's something that turns us away from ourselves, from our neighbor, and from God. It causes a rupture. And so the first effect is sin. And so when we say Christ came to save sinners, that's one of the primary things, to address that first aspect of sin, that first effect of sin, to bring about a healing. However, there's also a secondary effect of sin. Sin also causes a person to become enslaved to itself. Christ himself said that he who sins makes himself a slave to sin. And so not only is there a breaking of a relationship, but the person also begins to continue down a path that is leading to sin, that he is bound by this sin. And so when we talk about sin, it's not just as though it's a one and done sort of thing. There are lasting consequences to it. And so we see this kind of go into the idea of purgatory. This is actually one of the fundamental ideas behind purgatory, that though we might have a relationship rekindled with Christ, we still have an attachment to sin. We still have these things that draw us away. And so there has to be some sort of purgation, some sort of healing. Now, if we have that understanding regarding sin, we also see the same sorts of effects with acts of mercy, with acts of love, with prayer. That not only is there a sort of communion that is established by this act of kindness, this act of charity, but it also has a secondary effect of bringing about a healing, that the person becomes a better person. And so, for example, if I were to go and feed the homeless, the immediate effect is now this person has food, they are being cared for, that is good. But also I would become the type of person that cares about others. I would grow in empathy and sympathy, in compassion and humility. I would grow in these virtues. And so acts of charity, acts of good works bring about two effects as well. And this secondary effect, this growth in the spiritual life that happens, is something that undergirds the idea of indulgence. Now, why do I bring this up? Now, indulgences at their core are the repository of all of the just deeds of Christ and the saints. These are the good things that have now redounded out into the world. And so the church becomes the guardian of this. We can see this, by the way, in the book of Revelation, chapter 19, verse 8. The church is wreathed in the righteous deeds of the saints. We see that the church holds these righteous deeds. And so now the church, as the body of Christ, has this responsibility to ensure that these good deeds, these secondary effects of works of charity, are now being used for the good of the body of Christ. That's the idea of the indulgence, that what I do will affect myself and also affect those around me. As St. Paul says, if one member of the body of Christ rejoices, all rejoice. If one member of the body of Christ suffers, all suffer. That there's a communion that is brought about. That is the core of the idea of indulgences. Now, with that said, back in the 15th century, there was a bit of a problem. And Martin Luther, I think, actually acted rightly in a way. Now, indulgences had been around for a little while, but there was only really two documents that had actually addressed what indulgences were and how they were used. So there was some debate that was going on. Now, at the time of Martin Luther, there was two documents that I think are somewhat important for us to understand. The first is a document written by the Archbishop of Mainz. The Archbishop of Mainz was preaching this indulgence. However, there was some problems with it theologically. For example, he actually had a pay scale. So like I was saying, indulgences, the church has been given this great vast treasury of goodwill, that this treasury of the good deeds of the saints has secondary spiritual actions, and the church now is inviting people to do things to help gain them this indulgence, to help them inculcate in them the desire for good works, and so then the church then gives these things. The good work that was being talked about at this time was a collection used to build St. Peter's Basilica. And the Archbishop of Mainz was getting half of the money as well. And so the indulgence was, you pay us to get this indulgence. And there was a pay scale. The Archbishop of Mainz established a pay scale. If you were king, queen, or upper nobility, you would give 25 guilders. If you were an abbot or a lower nobility, you would give 10 guilders. If you were a prelate, a priest, or one of the very low nobility, you would give 10 guilders. Like, there is a whole pay scale of, if you did this, this is how much money you would have to give in order to get indulgence. That quite obviously is not what an indulgence is supposed to be. You're not supposed to have a pay scale to do this. You're supposed to be inculcated to do good works that bring about the building up of the body of Christ. That's the idea behind why the church asks us to do things to gain indulgences. And then push it further, we don't know what Tetzel said. However, we know what Martin Luther said Tetzel was saying. And it seems as though Tetzel, the Dominican preacher that was going out and raising funds for this sort of fundraiser, selling of indulgences, was telling the people that it didn't matter if they had contrition or not, if they're actually sorry for their sins or not. You put the coins in and the soul flies out of purgatory. No, that is not what was supposed to be taught. Tetzel actually went so far as to say that you could do the absolute worst things imaginable, and so long as you paid for the indulgence, you would go to heaven. Like, that is not what an indulgence is supposed to be. And so it's very clear, when Martin Luther was writing against indulgences, what was being preached at the time was not what the church actually taught. Now, that becomes somewhat of a problem, obviously. But I do want to say, to answer the actual question, the church's official teaching on indulgences has not changed since Martin Luther. However, when Martin Luther was actually coming into conflict with the idea of indulgences, what was being taught, what was being preached, was not what the church meant when she was teaching about indulgences. To conclude with all of this, when you personally are wanting to go and get an indulgence, normally what that will look like is to do some pious action, whether that be some sort of good work. There is the prayer that is necessary, prayer for the intentions of the Pope, and then go to confession and actually intend sorrow for sins. Those are the actual usual 3 obligations for receiving an indulgence as the church rightly understands it. As the church truly understands it.